And welcome. I'm Anand Naidu filling in for Riz Khan. Is the United States prompting a confrontation in South America? Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez thinks so and has told his military to be, quote, ready for combat. At issue is a U.S. plan to more than double its military presence in neighboring Colombia. U.S. President Barack Obama has said the additional troops are simply an expansion of its Plan Colombia, America's 10-year effort to fight regional drug trafficking. President Hugo Chavez describes the plan as Colombia turning over its military command to, as he puts it, the Yankees. Colombia's President Alvaro Uribe says his country needs greater American assistance to fight drug lords and FARC rebels. News of the U.S.-Colombia deal comes as Ecuador says it will end an agreement allowing the United States to operate an airbase in that country. On today's show, we look at the broader implications of America's military expansion in Colombia and ask what are America's motives in expanding its presence in Colombia. Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room, and then take part. Of course, we always welcome your phone calls on this show as well. Joining me to discuss this from New York, Dr. Gregory Wilpert, adjunct professor of political science at Brooklyn College and editor of the website Venezuela Analysis. He also wrote Changing Venezuela by Taking Power, the History and Policies of the Chavez Government. Here in Washington, I'm joined by Dr. Ray Walser, a senior policy analyst for Latin America at the Heritage Foundation. Previously, Dr. Walser was a career Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Department of State, where his assignments took him, among other countries, to Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Nicaragua. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. But before we get to you, I want to turn to our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, who is in Venezuela, actually in President Hugo Chavez's home state of Barinas. She comes to us via broadband. And Lucia, as I mentioned, you're right there in the home state of the president. What's been the response over there where you are?
Well, Anand, I think first of all, it's very important to remember that Colombia and Venezuela have a long, long history of territorial disputes. But the conflict and the relationship between President Hugo Chavez and his right-wing counterpart, Alvaro Uribe in Colombia, is also ideological. Now, President Hugo Chavez has said that the increased U.S. military presence in Colombia means that both the United States and Colombia are positioning themselves for war against this country. In fact, he's gone as far as to say that the whole region would be on the doorsteps of a military conflict. Now, whether he really believes that or not, I think it's very clear that he does feel threatened by this increased or planned increased military presence by the United States in Colombia, which has the second largest military force in this region, probably the best trained army, in fact, in the whole region. So his response this week was first to cut fuel to Colombia, a very, very important fuel deal to that country, and also he is trying to substitute the multi-billion-dollar trade between both countries by signing deals for everything from rice, meat, and perfume to 10,000 cars, for example, by buying them from Argentina instead of Colombia.
Now, Lucia, there has been some concern expressed by regional leaders to what is going on there in South America. What have they been saying about this spat?
Well, first of all, when they met earlier this week in Ecuador for the inauguration of Ecuador's president, they warned President Chavez, or they asked President Chavez to lower what they call the inflammatory rhetoric about war being imminent in the region. However, it's very clear that all the South American leaders, except perhaps Peru's president, are concerned about the U.S., about an increased U.S. military presence just right in the middle of South America, especially at a time when this region was really making incredible strides towards regional economic integration and also towards a political and also a military alliance. They see this as very destabilizing in that sense. And so UNASUR presidents, that is the presidents of all of the South American countries, including Colombia, will be meeting at the end of this month in Bariloche, Argentina, where the regional leaders will be trying to convince President Uribe to change his mind and to back down on this deal with the United States.
And you have been there for a long time. You've been covering the story for a long time, as you pointed out to us. Any way of gauging how ordinary Venezuelans view this?
I think ordinary Venezuelans and probably ordinary Colombians as well feel a little bit jittery. I mean, they're hearing all this talk about a forthcoming military conflict. The sort of the war drums are beating. Whether they're really convinced that this is going to happen or not, they know that it is destabilizing. It's bad for trade, and it's bad, therefore, for the region, which, as I said earlier, is making these unprecedented steps towards coming together and strengthening their position so that they can barter with other more politically and economically powerful nations around the world. So it's considered bad news for everyone here, I would say. I don't know too many people that support this increased military pressure or presence, or people who believe really that it's necessary for Colombia to fight drug trafficking.
All right, thanks, Lucia. Lucia Newman there talking to us from Venezuela. Let's go now to our guests. I want to go first to Dr. Gregory Wilpert, who joins us from New York. Let me start with you. Under this plan, the United States will have access to up to 7 Colombian bases. Now, Venezuela's president has responded with words like the winds of war are beginning to blow across the region, and as we just mentioned, the Yankees have started to command Colombian forces. Is this just hyperbole, or does he really have serious concerns?
Well, I don't think it's all that realistic to think that the United States would actually engage into an armed conflict with Venezuela. But actually, the real problem is that the U.S. presence in Colombia is certain to heat up the civil war in Colombia. And this has lots of profound problems for Venezuela. For example, Venezuela has already something like 4 million Colombians living in Venezuela who basically would extending or intensifying the conflict in Colombia could mean more refugees. It also has spilled over, the conflict has spilled over many times into Venezuela and has caused many problems along Venezuela's border. So this is a real problem in that sense, and this is something that Chavez, I think, is rightly very concerned about, because the conflict in Colombia has brought so many problems to Venezuela. And if the trade were to be cut off because of Chavez's attempt to prevent the bases, that would just alienate the two countries even more. And right now, the trade has been a very stabilizing factor, enabling Chavez and Uribe to get along when they are ideologically quite far apart. But if that trade is no longer there, then that could indeed lead to a more serious conflict in the future.
Dr. Walter, do you agree that an increased U.S. presence could aggravate the civil war inside Colombia and lead to an influx of refugees into Venezuela?
Well, I think, first of all, let's go back and correct a couple of the facts there. First of all, my understanding is that the agreement, which has not been made fully public, may be finished this week, would give the access to roughly 7 bases. The concentrated base is one called Palenquero, which I think is about 60 miles northwest of Bogota. The U.S. will support construction of infrastructure, a couple of hangars. My understanding is that there's not going to be any increase in U.S. presence. I think there's a current cap of about 800 uniformed individuals, about 600 contractors working on Plan Colombia. So the intent of this operation is to transfer from Manta, which just ran its last operational flights over the Pacific in July, is to set up a operational to bring in surveillance planes, AWACS, P3s, which largely will either operate over Colombian airspace, over the Pacific, or the Caribbean. So it's a surveillance and intelligence gathering operation. It will support both the counter-narcotics efforts, and it will also support anti-terrorist activities. But the U.S. will play no larger role in the struggle against the FARC, will continue to pursue its primary goal, which is preventing the trafficking of narcotics, for which the FARC is heavily engaged in. And I don't see that this will lead to any intensifying of the internal conflict. It's not over, but the FARC is on the run. It's going out of the country. That's why it's going into Venezuela. It's going into Ecuador. And so I think this will keep the pressure on the FARC, and the FARC has to eventually see that it has no military option to pursue, and that's when you can enter into a negotiated endgame.
But given the United States' history in South America, Hugo Chavez would have a point, wouldn't he?
Well, the history in South America, there are not many, there are no bases. Name me a base other than Manta.
Yes, but given the history of America's involvement in South America, in destabilizing governments in South America.
Well, I'd say that's something of the past. We're not out to destabilize, we're out to support Colombia is the purpose of this mission. It's being carried out by Barack Obama, not exactly. This is not George Bush's policy. It is part of a consolidating effort to deal on the security front with the drugs. They're also seeing at this particular point an augmentation in Caribbean security. They're negotiating a new $40 million pact, not much, but new attention to the Caribbean, the Merida Initiative to try to help in the war against the drug cartels. You've got to come to Colombia. You need a regional program, and the problem is that Chavez and his anti-American program, Ecuador's non-participation, Bolivia's non-participation in the anti-drug war is not going to help things. It's going to make it much more complicated than it need be, and as you said, is beating the sort of the drums of war. But the Colombians are not doing this. This is Chavez, and he's also using it as a means to distract from some recent incidents, such as the appearance of some Swedish-made weapons that were taken from the Venezuelan arsenals and end up in the hands of the FARC. So he uses it as a distraction. He's kind of, don't look at my left hand, not at my right.
I want to get to the weapons in a moment, but let me allow Dr. Wilpert to respond to that.
Well, yeah, actually, I wanted to respond to the weapons issue because those weapons were weapons that were stolen from Venezuela back in 1995, and Chavez has provided evidence for that so far. So, I mean, I don't think that this is a distraction on the part of Chavez. Actually, Chavez has complained from the start, before the new evidence came out. The real issue, I think, is that the United States is doing its foreign policy in Latin America through the Defense Department rather than the State Department. In that sense, there's a continuation of Bush policy. That is, for example, back in last year, the U.S. government reactivated the 4th Fleet to patrol waters off of Latin America, and now Obama has been relatively tepid in his opposition to the coup attempt in Honduras. And so all of this adds up to the general impression in Latin America that the United States government is not changing course in Latin America, and that it is more interested in pursuing a kind of unilateralistic policy in the region without really consulting with the countries that are being involved, that are affected. And this has alienated people throughout Latin America, and Chavez just happens to be the most forceful spokesperson on this issue.
Is that the case, Dr. Walter? The Pentagon?
I would disagree. First of all, on the arms issue, the Venezuelans first denied that this had taken place at all. Secondly, then they came back and said, oh, we've looked at it, it was 1995. Although exchanges of materials taken from the Reyes computer indicate that Ivan Marquez from Caracas was communicating to Raul Reyes that he was sending roughly 20 bazookas or fairly high-powered armament. So the transaction probably took place sometime in late 2007. They were captured last summer and have just slowly that sort of emerged. Now I've lost my train on the others.
Well, to be fair, though, a defense expert in Britain from the defense publication James has said that it doesn't prove anything because of what he calls seepage by corrupt officers who could have sold these weapons.
No, weapons do exchange. I mean, I'm just saying that there are Greg's going to take one interpretation, I'm going to take the other. Okay. I see these as probably having transferred during the period of closest interaction between the FARC and the Venezuelan authorities, between General Carvajal and the others, and that particularly took place in late 2007 and early 2008, well before March, when Chavez may have begun to distance himself at least from overt supply to the FARC.
Okay, we will continue the discussion, but we've got to take a short break right now. More of our discussion in a moment. As we pause, let me remind you that you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. We're taking a viewer poll there right now asking, why is the US putting more troops into Colombia? We'll be right back after the break with some of your answers. Stay with us.